right. Great. Well, thank you all. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I made like a very simple PowerPoint just as a guide, really. We're hoping today is really more of a conversation. I have some like resources on here about secondary data, and I wanted to give just an example of a project I'm working on just to kind of get thoughts flowing and everything. But please jump in at any time and I'll definitely pause and hopefully, and stop sharing and we can have conversations about different things. And then after I get through the PowerPoint slides, I know we'll be engaging in a larger conversation just on anything that was sparked for you during the presentation. So I'm going to be talking about using secondary data sources for school-based research. I just want to caveat this that I am pretty novel to this. I am in my last year of my PhD program at Michigan State, and I have used secondary data a couple times for different milestones, but I am by no means an expert. So I just, this conversation started, I think, during the last SEIG meeting. And so I am here hoping to learn with and from everyone. So just want to start with that. Why secondary data? There are so many other reasons, but one of the things that we talked about during the last SEIG meeting was that Michelle and Ben presented on their community-based research, which was incredible. And they also expressed the amount of time that it can take to engage in these really big projects. And if you're in a position where you're kind of expected to be producing scholarly work on a regular basis, that's a practical reality for a lot of folks. And so that's maybe one reason that secondary data is a great route to answer interesting questions, using existing data so that you're not kind of held up by other factors for the community-based work you engage in. I think another thing that's really important is that if there is data that answers the questions you're interested in, it's probably best to check that first before maybe going and engaging in, primary data collection, just because there's a ton of data out there. And, especially if you're doing school-based work, as well as, a lot of other research too. This is not unique to school-based research, but students, families, and schools have a ton of obligations and they already do so many surveys. Teachers have a ton of data they collect and analyze on their own, and schools as well. So if there are existing data sets that can answer your questions, it's great to be able to reduce that burden. And, there's also the opportunity to do a broader examination of a large data set and then, follow up with a more localized study or something like that. But I think that's a really important point. And then something else this is something that I thought of, and just some of the data that I've encountered that is like publicly available, is that I think there's a push towards, local cities, governments, school systems to be more transparent. And part of that is publishing data, but I don't think it's always published in a manner that's incredibly accessible. So, having hundreds of Excel sheets with thousands of observations maybe isn't like incredibly accessible for someone to quickly go summarize that data. So if you are working with publicly available data, if you have the opportunity to even just post like a summary, like a one-pager summary of what you found when you examine that data, I think that could be really powerful and kind of give back to folks who don't have the same amount of time or resources to go through all that data. So those are just some ideas. I took this from Dr. Bill Chopik. He's at Michigan State. He does like secondary data as his thing. He put on a talk that I went to, and this is where I kind of took from. And these are the steps that he outlined for engaging in a secondary data analysis project. And I think bullet points 1 and 2 are probably, maybe interchangeable, but, the first couple steps are really kind of formulating your research question and then searching for potential data sets to see, if they align with those research questions. And then familiarizing yourself with codebooks and existing reports. That's going to vary a lot depending on the data source. I think the next slide has some data sources, or the one after that, some like Ad Health, which is the longitudinal study of adolescent health. They have everything on their website. They have code books, they have everything that's ever been published on their data set. Like they're very much so trying to get people to use this data. Other data might not be like that, especially publicly available data, and you're going to have to do a lot of digging to try to find some of that information, but it's definitely worth the time in my experience. In addition to that, evaluating, the quality of measures, the patterns of missing data, and then, that's a good opportunity to maybe reformulate your research question, because depending on the structure of the data, how much missingness there is, you might need to think about, looking at different measures or variables. Once you kind of have your finalized research question, you can specify your analytic plan, prepare your data for analyses, conduct them, and then interpret the results and write up your report. That's obviously a very simple way to put it, but these are kind of the overall steps that he recommends. Okay, so I'm going to just go through some secondary data sources, and then we're going to pause after that just to see if anyone has anything to add or maybe has experience with any of these data sources. And I know all of this information is going to be sent out to everyone on the listserv, just, so you don't need to worry about trying to write down any of the names or anything. These are just some that I've encountered or I've heard of before. So the first one I already mentioned at Ad Health. It's a longitudinal study of adolescent health. There's a ton of data. I think it's like 20 years, maybe even more. Long study. Similarly, there's the longitudinal study of early childcare and youth development. And they have, these links take you to all their data sets, all their code books. One that many of you may have heard of, especially if you're like a member of AERA, is the Stanford Education Data Archive. That's really focused on like standardized testing across the nation. But that I highly recommend looking at their website, because they really want people to look at their data and use that data. They've worked incredibly hard to essentially make standardized test scores in each state comparable to each other, so you can kind of look at national trends. And they have everything. They have so many data sets. They have different like scripts and documentation for you to use for analyses. And they put on trainings all the time. So even if you don't use that data, it's a good opportunity to go to a training to see like their process for going about, handling this data. So that's a really great resource. There's the Youth Risk Behavioral Surveillance System, and that's housed by the CDC, although I know at least in the Michigan context, I cannot speak to other states. I think our education system actually holds like the domain to this data, so it's a little bit harder to access. What's publicly available is like county level reports, and then you would need to go through like school, district, state levels of review to actually get access to student level, school level, whatever data. So that's just something to consider. Some other ones that are these two very specific to like school-based research is the Common Core of data. And that has a lot of information on just public schools. So some different like Title I status, whether they have a free and reduced lunch program, civil rights data collection, also publicly available at the school level, and civil rights, it's the civil rights data collection that's actually housed through the Office of Civil Rights. So obviously a lot of their data is focused on breaking down different student outcomes by demographic information. So most of their categories are like, what are the disciplinary outcomes for students with disabilities who are female of X race or ethnicity. And so they break it down that way because they're really tracking with the hopes of looking at equity and civil rights issues. Something Sarah passed along, which is great, is SCRA has a resource list of secondary data sources. So we put that on there as well. And some of these are duplicated on that webpage, but others are new. Sorry. And then one other thing I want to note is that sometimes the data are publicly available. Sometimes you have to go through like a third party that houses data. So for example, there's ICPSR at University of Michigan, and they kind of have their own like mini, IRB process almost, where you have to like submit, why you want the data, what you're looking at it for. And then you would obviously need to go through your own IRB approval at your university. But, that's one level of just trying to protect that data a little bit, even though it is available as long as you're using it for good use. So, and then I also just wanted to highlight that there's a lot of local data available for specifically school-based research. Under the Every Student Succeeds Act, states are required to publish accountability data on a bunch of student outcomes and school factors and, district finances, all of that. So I put a link to Michigan's website because that's one I'm familiar with, but I'm assuming every state has something comparable, even if it's, different structured or, So that's one potential resource. And then a lot of city and state governments also publish open source data. So the one I'm familiar with in my areas, I know Lansing has a website where they have publicly available GIS data, so spatial information. And they also publish local policing data and things like that. So this is by no means exhaustive, but just some examples of local data that are available. So I wanted to just pause and see if anyone has used any of these data sources or their, and their experience with them, or if there are other data sources that are not on this list that you've used.
One thing I wanted to add is, or just kind of underscore, is you mentioned in your slide about why using secondary data. I'm working on a project right now that's focused on digital inclusion and equity in a neighborhood, essentially. And one of the things that they talked about when we were starting this project is we don't want researchers coming in and asking questions we already know the answers to. And so that really prompted us to, rather than just start with okay, let's talk to the community, let's do surveys and focus groups. Before that, we did a long a literature review of best practices. We did interviews with stakeholders to see what data they had already. And then that pointed us to some of these sources that you're talking about, census data, or some of the data that places collected or know of internally. So I just think that that's one thing that we really need to think about a lot as community psychologists. I think we all are excited and eager to talk to the community, and I will be probably the first person to say that. I don't want to go looking at all these spreadsheets. That doesn't sound that exciting. I want to be in the community. But I think there is a really important thing we should think about in using this kind of data, we don't need to ask community members what their income and what their certain things that their demographics are, when we can find that information in the census data. That doesn't answer your question specifically about what sources we're using, but I just think this is so important.
I was gonna say, I haven't used any of the major publicly available data sources, but something you were also mentioning, Jen, is how much data schools are just collecting themselves. And that's something I've been working with one middle school for a couple of years. And this year, one of the things that they've been having me work on is, I feel a lot of schools have a bunch of streams of data that are not all in one place. At least this school, they have one system for academic data. They have one system for standardized test data. They have one system for PBIS data and one system for behavior data. And so they've been having me build them into one big data set. And that's primarily in service of the school, but then they'll let me use analysis with them, do analysis on that data set as well. And I feel for some of us who are doing community engaged research, if maybe some of these big data sets that already exist don't meet our needs, this can be sort of a halfway point where it's we're not asking the school to do anything new. It's mainly just a lot of at least for me, fighting with Stata to get everything merged in correctly, and a way to take advantage of the stuff they already have. And at least for me, because it's all the students, we're not having the issues we've had before with students filling things out and getting, a representative sample. So it's been a nice sort of medium for me.
All right, great. Anything else before we keep the conversation going? No? Okay.
I have
Oh.
used YRBS,
Okay.
but I don't know that much about it. I'm using that term lightly because I haven't had time to get to using it, but my grad student has ideas for it. And we have like a research team in our department around the YRBS data. So for some reason in Florida, we had to have like IRB approval we had data approval from like the state or something to use the data. Like other faculty don't have public access to it here. Maybe they do in other states, but I know faculty here from other departments have been like, oh, how do you have access to that data? But it's still, I'm pretty sure it's still just the district level because we just talked about that we can't track like individual students. But yeah, so I plan to use that. It's challenging for me and I think other people who might be trained in different methods where I'm used to like intervention studies where you follow the same people over time. And this is like a massive data set that's like cross-sectional over time, because it's district data. So I feel a little out of my wheelhouse. Like I know plenty of quantitative stats for intervention stuff, but not as much for cross-sectional. So I feel kind of, like I promise I know stats, but not really these. But I'm going to use it at some point. So we'll see how that goes. And you made a great point, Sarah, about collecting like income data. It's been really interesting to work with the youth on our YPAR project because we created the survey together. And they were very adamant about not asking for SES. And I taught them about demographics and what they all mean and like why we collect them, which made me really think about like, why do we collect some of these? And I know that some's for like replication purposes to like describe our sample, but kind of like we can find close enough stuff from like the census and things like that or other avenues that I feel like we don't necessarily need to ask some of the stuff that we do. Just hearing them talk about how kind of like offensive it is to ask people you don't know about that was really interesting. They suggested, which is what we did, to ask what neighborhood they're in, because I kind of explained it as for our study, we're looking to take action based on their findings. So if we know like, about their income level and we could potentially like, and the location of certain communities, we could potentially help them. And so they were kind of like, well, you can just ask what neighborhood they're from and then everyone will know. And that gives you kind of enough information. And I thought that was really interesting as a way to kind of learn SES by proxy, I guess, because, you look up the stats on that community and can kind of see. But yeah, those demographic questions are interesting and have really made me like rethink or contemplate, I guess, why we ask those questions. Those are kind of my two things. So I haven't used secondary data. I'm kind of intimidated by it. I will use the YRBS at some point, and then I agree about finding other ways to collect some of the data that we gather versus like asking people kind of questions they might be offended by.
Great, thank you. All right. So speaking of analysis, I am also definitely not an expert by any means. I'm going to get into the kind of example project I'm talking about, which is my dissertation project. But here's just some considerations for analysis, and then I'll talk about some specific examples I encountered during my project. But like you mentioned, Michelle, the YRBS data you have access to is at the district level. That's an important consideration when you think about your analysis. What is your unit of observation? Is it longitudinal? Is it the data collected at the same time point every year? What does that look like? Some of the quantitative skills that I think that bullet point 1 under there is really important with secondary data and sometimes overlooked. Like you can have the fanciest stat skills in the world, but if you can't, work with Excel, you might be having a really hard time with some of these data sets. And a lot of them, like Ad Health and the other like research study ones, a lot of them come in multiple file formats. They might already be cleaned. But if you're working with more like school data or publicly available data, it might look very different. You might have to merge a bunch of different files. And so, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the issues I encountered with that in my project, but those are just some considerations. If you are using those, like the research study published data sets, you'll want to make sure you have all the information on the measures and what they mean, what their reliability validity is. And you'll want to make sure that you're examining patterns of missing data and handling outliers appropriately. Okay, so I'm just gonna kind of dive into a really quick overview of my dissertation project here, but more importantly, talking about the data sources that I used and some of the issues I've encountered, or things I've dealt with by using secondary data. So specifically, I'm using something called My School Data. So that's the Michigan Department of Education. That's where they publish all their school accountability data. So I'm using that data source and the civil rights data collection that I talked about as a data source to look at trends in Michigan school districts that have kind of been flagged as requiring the most intense level of state intervention under the accountability system under the Every Student Succeeds Act. And I identified a match comparison sample for these districts, and I'm examining these trends over time. And I really want to look at the extent to which different contextual factors, when I say that, I mean like proxy variables that I've been able to source from this data that might represent contextual factors, but see the extent to which they impact school resources and student outcomes, and looking at whether, these schools and these districts that have kind of been flagged as underperforming per the accountability system, whether they differ from this higher performing match comparison sample in terms of student outcomes across different subgroups. So is it that maybe these schools that are not requiring intervention serve different student populations, is kind of my thinking behind that. So this is some of the data that I sourced. I actually sourced a lot more data than this, but these are just some examples of the type of data that you can potentially get if you're looking at your state's like publicly available accountability data, as well as some examples of what is available on the civil rights data collection. So from My School Data, I was able to get most of this data at the school level. Any financial data is most likely going to be available at the district level, but enrollment data, so looking at overall number of students as well as broken down by these different categories, so by race and ethnicity, by free and reduced lunch status, whether they have an IEP, whether they're categorized as an English language learner or not, as well as attendance rates broken down by all those categories, test scores for all those categories. I was able to source some information on the number of teachers or paraeducators that are at a school. And then at the district level, looking at more than this, but expenditures, revenue, their years in deficit, fund balance, all of that data is publicly available. And I sourced some of that for my project. And then from CRDC, I was able to get some disciplinary data, which I found, at least in Michigan, is harder to get on their system. So I was really excited to be able to find suspension data, and they also had it broken down by different categories of students, and that was at the school level. And then they also have information on support staff. So they had the number of nurses, psychologists, and social workers at the school level. So that's just some of the data that I sourced. And here's just some of the things that I have learned and had to consider through my project. So obviously I linked two separate sources of data, and those two sources identified schools with different codes. So one of the biggest undertakings of my project was actually just creating a key that would link the CRDC school code to the My School Data school code. And it seems silly, but it took me 3 full days of work to do this. And so it took a lot of playing around in Excel and then merging, and I did that in SPSS, but it was very time consuming. So you'll want to think about how these maybe units of observation are identified if you're merging different sources of data, and check whether any keys currently exist for that. In addition, the CRDC specifically, their data is only available every other year, whereas in my school data, all of the constructs I was interested in are available every year. So then I have to make some decisions around my analytic approach. Am I kind of creating an average over time for these CRDC variables? Am I duplicating time points? Am I just having them set as missing for 1 year? So those are some of the considerations I have to make. And my proposal is like next week. So I will have more specific details to come. The other consideration was identifying my sample. So, are you, specifically with my school data, like, am I including every school, or am I perhaps excluding adult education programs, alternative programs? And I need to see how those are identified in the data to determine how I can exclude them and make sure I have a justification and I'm writing up that part of, identifying my sample. I said lower level units. Okay, so technically, because I'm doing multi-level modeling, my lower level unit is time, but my unit of observation is at the school level for most of my variables. And that can make things kind of complicated because instead of having like individuals and like, for example, all of their demographic characteristics, I have a school and then a different outcome for every single group of students that I'm interested in looking at. And that becomes complicated because that could give me, 25 potential outcomes for attendance if I have attendance for all students, attendance for female students, attendance for male students, so on and so forth. And so I just had to think a little bit more carefully and make sure that I have a really good reason to include the variables I want to include, and think about, especially with my analytic approach, like models converging and things like that. If you have so many dependent variables, that can be a little bit complicated. A specific example for this is, I'm looking at test scores for math and English language arts. And specifically in Michigan, the standardized tests they administer, the scores are not comparable within or between grades or between subjects. So I would technically have to have separate outcomes for a third grader's math score, a third grader's ELA score, fourth grade math scores, fourth grade ELA scores, so on, for all the grades that I'm looking at. And in my sample, I was looking at grades 3 through 8. So that would be 10 dependent variables just for test scores. So I had to come up with a different approach just because that was a bit unwieldy. So I had to calculate z-scores and average them so that each school only had one outcome for math and one outcome for ELA. So these are just some examples of what I've encountered in my dissertation project. I think that's all I have. Yeah. And I think the hope is really just to hear more from people who have, used secondary data or who are interested in using secondary data, and maybe some of the concerns you've had when you've used secondary data, or if you're interested in it, what are your concerns? And then I think also potentially identifying opportunities for collaboration within the interest group. Am I correct, Sarah? Yes. Okay, good. So I guess the first part being, if you have used secondary data, I mean, Michelle, you talked about this a little bit, you have to deal with observations being at the district level. What kind of things have you encountered if you use secondary data? If you're interested in using secondary data, what types of things maybe are you concerned about or have questions about, so we can try to learn from each other?
Again, kind of saying something you already said, but maybe just repeating it because I think it's so important, about just like learning the data and how it can be messy and like in my experience working with secondary data, like you have this idea that like the answer that you're looking for is just like waiting for you to just be found. And it's often not the case. Like you have to go through sometimes several different levels of approval. Then once you get the data, there, like you have all these questions because like you didn't collect the data. So you don't understand, like, you know, when you just have like a variable name, like if there's not like a, like you said, a code book or someone you can ask about like, okay, what does this mean and how is it collected? And like all of those kind of questions take you a while to like disentangle. And then like missing data, like just again, all the things you've said already, but not to say that, okay, well, it's really hard, so you shouldn't use it. Just that, like, I think there is, sometimes you think that like, because you're using secondary data, that it's going to be easier than collecting your own data, which in some cases it is, in some cases it isn't, but we should still be using it. So I don't want to like backtrack on what I was saying earlier.
No, that's so great. Oh, Amber, yes.
For my dissertation, I use secondary data. I use the National Longitudinal Transition Study too. And one of the things that I was not aware of prior to attempting to get the data is the multitude of steps that had to be taken and the security that had to be taken once the data was received. And so that may be something to just consider. I had the same thought like, oh, you know what, this would be easier. Like I could do, you know, various statistical analysis given my sample size, which yes, I was able to, but sort of the preparation that it takes to get that access is something to think about if you're planning to use that, because I mean, it was a process. It was definitely a process, like little things like, hey, the data had to be stored on a laptop on a desktop in an office that was locked, that you didn't have anything else on that desktop. And no one could go into that space. So like even to take out the trash, you had to put the wastebasket outside of the office because the people that come to clean the office were not permitted to go into that office with that data on that computer. So just little logistical things to consider when you're doing your planning.
Thank you, Amber. Yeah, that's a great point. And one thing I'll say, kind of jumping on what Sarah said, specifically the two data sources I'm looking at are publicly available. So they're like anyone can go online, download it, look at it. So that also means there's not like a code book or existing resources that kind of tell you what everything means. I think CRDC does a pretty good job. Like all of their files have like descriptions in them. But for Michigan's like accountability system, I was like on the Department of Education's website. I read their plan for the Every Student Succeeds Act, and that told me, you know, what everything meant eventually, but that's like a 100-page document. So sometimes it can take a lot of work, especially for those data sets that are not like a research study. I think sometimes those are more readily available, but they take more approval to get access to and can be really complicated for like storage and everything, like Amber said. All right, well, I think there are other items on the agenda, right? Sorry, I don't want to take up the whole meeting. So feel free to like, you know, reach out. I think we'll be sharing out this information via some sort of like one-pager information sheet. But I do think we hope to continue talking about potential project ideas using secondary data as a group. Many of you know there's like a school safety statement that's being drafted. So I think when that gets wrapped up, this group will probably have some capacity to try and engage in a different collaborative project.
Yeah, thanks, Jen, for getting the conversation started. I feel like this is just kind of the start of more to come for our interest group, but so don't feel like it ends today. But with that, I think we will turn it over. You can probably stop the recording, Amber. I can stop it.